Alright, well, I'm needing this truck to haul a little dirt, and so I fired it up and drove it out of the weeds over there where it's been mothballed for the past 2 years or so. I'm squirting a little air in that tire right now, but anyway, when I fired it up, I didn't have any kind of oil pressure reading on my gauges there in the cab, which that's not a manual gauge, it's a electronic gauge, you know, reading through the data link there on the, coming from the ECM. So plugged into it with CAT ET, had a bunch of codes, and I knew that with that number of codes, it's really only one of two things that can be causing that. Either your wiring harness is destroyed, like a rat got in it and chewed it all to shit, or the ECM is going bad. So I took a quick look at the wiring harness and I could tell that it was fine. So I just went ahead and grabbed the ECM off that other truck right there. That's one I drug out of a landfill up in northern Indiana somewhere, I think. Anyway, same truck, ECM was already programmed and ready to go, so I just stuck it on here. See if those codes are all gone. Yep. 0 active codes. Crawl up in the cab and fire it up, make sure the gauges work. Yeah, we're all good now. The other big problem with this piece of shit is one that I've always known that it had, and that's that the engine has got an extravagant amount of blow-by. I mean, it's pretty bad. And this second breather tube right here is not even supposed to be there. That's one they've added because the blow-by was so bad. I mean, look at it, it's still smoking. So I'm gonna regret it if I don't fix it now. I guess I'll just go ahead and do it. All right, so here's gonna be the plan. If you've watched the other engine build videos on the channel here, you've seen what it looks like to do the high dollar, high end rebuilds on these engines. So what I'm going to do on this one is show you the exact opposite. I'm going to do a quick, cheap end frame on this as cheaply as I can possibly do it. And I'm going to show you that you can still get a satisfactory result even with nothing but a bunch of junk if you do it right and use a little bit of common sense. Alright, I got the belly pan pulled off of it and the hood just came off. So I'm just about ready to back at the shop. I've got a couple other little things I want to do before I do that though. Before I swap the engine ECM out for the one that I've got on here now, the only Jake housing that was coming on was the center one, so I was only getting 2 cylinders worth of Jake brake. So now that I've changed the ECM, I want to see if that's still the case or if that's fixed. Jakes are still not working on the front and the rear housing. Only the middle one is coming on still yet, so that problem is still there. All right, this is a little bit unrelated to the video, but I wanted to throw this in somewhere towards the beginning. It won't take long. This YouTube channel has proven to be a pretty good way for me to find people and for people to find me on various different things. So I want to use that to my advantage as much as I can, obviously. So I'm always looking for deals on cheap junk equipment to buy. I like to buy the stuff that's completely worn out or doesn't run or has major mechanical problems or is partially disassembled, whatever the case may be. The stuff that most people don't really want to mess with, and a lot of times they just want it out of their way. That's the kind of stuff I like to buy. I've bought several machines like that over the years, and usually the hardest part of it is just finding it and knowing that it's there. So if you've got anything like that out there that you want to get rid of, let me know. I might be interested in it. I'm not really looking for any smaller machines. I don't need any skid steers or backhoes or forklifts or anything like that. I'm mostly interested in the bigger stuff, like 60 to 70,000 pound machines and bigger. Dozers, loaders, excavators, haul trucks, diesel engines, 10-liter and bigger, generators, things like that. And I'm the most interested in Caterpillar stuff, but it doesn't have to be Cat. I would buy anything just depending on what the deal is. So if you've got anything out there like that, let me know. Shoot me an email to kt3406e@gmail.com. Just let me know what you've got, where it's at, and how much you need for it. And then if I'm interested, we can get into the details after that. Even if it's 5 or 10 years down the road from now, I'm sure I'll keep that email address active. So let me know what you got, and back to the video now. So it doesn't really matter where I start on this, I just got to start somewhere. I guess pulling the cam gear off of it's as good a place as any. To do that, I've got to pull that peanut cover off right there. Alright, I got the peanut cover off. You can probably see why they call it a peanut cover. So now I can get to the cam gear, which is that big gear right there. Got to pull those 6 bolts out of the center of it, and then I can pull it off of there. Some kind of Loctite looks like. That shouldn't be there. Okay, now I've got a 3/8/16 bolt, and there's going to be a threaded hole in this thing here somewhere. Right there. And now I've got a little bit of a handle to work this thing off here. That one's going to be tight. I'm going to have both hands. Took me about 1 hour and 15 minutes to get that cam gear off. Should be about a 4-minute job, normally 3 to 4. If you get a stubborn one, they will sometimes be a little tight coming off. You just got to take a hammer and tap on both sides of them and work it off. It's no big deal. I've taken off probably 200 plus of them, and this is by far the worst one I've ever had. As you can see right there, that white stuff on that dowel, that's Loctite, and that's why I had to fight that so hard. Kind of ironic, these bolts here that hold this retaining ring on, he wasn't too worried about Loctiting those in, obviously, because they're working their way out. We're using Loctite where we shouldn't be, but we're not using it where we absolutely need to be. I'm jacking the cab up. It should give me a little more room. So you just pump this handle and you can see that cylinder pushing the cab up. And then put that in there so it can't fall on you. I've got some of the turbo piping and stuff off. Turbo outlet pipe from here to the charge air cooler inlet right there is gone, and the intake elbow from the air cleaner to the turbo inlet is gone. I've got this section of exhaust pipe here from the turbo turbine housing outlet back to this elbow, which 90s up and goes to the exhaust stack. That's all out of there. Turbo's in good shape. That's a pretty fresh Cat reman turbo. There's a lot of fresh reman parts on this engine. I don't really know what the story there is, but all right, I think I've pretty well got everything loose from the head that's got to be loose in order to let the head come off. So next thing to do is pull the valve covers off, and I'll start pulling the jakes and rocket arms and injectors out of the head. I'll get the rocket arms and shafts pulled out of here next. Valve bridges. And the Jake studs, I've got them double nutted here. This one's double nutted. That's a new injector harness in there. And now the valve cover base is going to come off. Only thing left in the head now is the camshaft and the 6 injectors. I'll pull the injectors out next. Sometimes these come out harder than this. These are just barely hanging, so no big deal. It's not taking hardly anything to get them out. Otherwise, I'd have a little better tool than this goofy piece of shit I'm using here. These are all fairly new reman injectors too. I've still got to come up here and get the cam retaining ring and adapter out of here. So I got to get those 3 bolts out of this ring right here. And then this ring will come off and then this adapter will come out. Alright, here's that retaining ring and the adapter. You can see some Loctite residue down in that hole there. And that's why I had so much trouble getting this cam gear off. Okay, I've got 26 head bolts to take out, and then I can start lifting on the head. Trying to see what I've got hanging, if anything. Maybe some wires running under that thermostat housing. The problem that I'm seeing now though is that I'm not going to have enough lift to get it to clear this handrail over here. Alright, I got the handrail pulled off, so it shouldn't be long now before I fall off here and break my back. But I've got the head swung out ready to drop to the ground. That should work out just fine. And here's what it looks like. Number 3 is completely wiped out. It's even worse than it looks on this camera. Those grooves are really deep. That is what you call a bad cylinder. I'll take a look at that cylinder head later. I don't think there's going to be anything wrong with it. The next thing to do is get in here and get the pan dropped off of it. So I'll have to remove that oil drain line right there, and I'll pull these 2 oil lines here. Those are going over to the remote mount oil filter base, which is right up there. And I'm gonna do everything I can to leave that line right there on there. That's a cooler line. I don't really want to dump the oil out of that system, so I'm gonna try to leave that one there, but I'll get these other 2 out of the way. I got the oil pan dropped off of it. What a pain in the ass. There's no block stiffener plate on the engines in these haul trucks. I'm guessing that's because these frames are so rigid that there's no need for it, compared to like an on-highway truck engine where the frame is kind of springy and always moving around. These are not. Alright, rods and pistons are coming out. That's number 2 and number 5 right there. And I just rolled number 1 and number 6 down to bottom dead center so I can get the impact on the rod bolts. And as I'm going here, I'm pulling the piston cooling jets out, keeping them in order. So when I get all 6 of them out, I'll compare them. There's number 6. There's number 1. Oh. Okay, I've got all 6 of them out. Here's what I found. Number 3's bad. Already knew that, had already seen it. And it's real bad. Couldn't see number 1 or number 6 before because the pistons were at the top, but I can see them now, and number 1 is also scuffed pretty bad. It's not as bad as number 3, but it's pretty bad. For the most part, number 2, 4, 5, and 6 are all okay, but I can tell that there's a little bit of light scuffing in all of them. As far as what I thought I was going to find initially, which is a bent piston cooling jet, I did not find that. Here's all 6 of them in order. Here would be 2 and 3, 3 being the worst cylinder. You can see, I mean, I'm not holding that perfect, but it's not bent. So all 6 of those are good. They were not the problem. Another thing I noticed, these are IPD pistons and the bearings were IPD, so they used an IPD kit when they rebuilt this engine. And I'm sure there will be a lot of people that will say, well, there's your answer. They used junk IPD parts and that's why it failed. I tend not to think like that. I've seen a lot of engines built using IPD parts that did not scuff liners and pistons and that did not fail prematurely. So I think there was something more at play here than just the fact that this is IPD. Something else, this is number 1. You can see the top ring and the middle ring are both broken. Of course, the skirt is scuffed pretty bad. This is, like I said, number 1, which is one of the holes that were scuffed. This is number 3 right here. This is the worst scuffed liner. And I don't think the rings are broke on this one. Of course, we got the bad scuffing on the skirt. The oil control ring's all screwed up. And the other 2 rings are stuck. I don't really see anything too far out of the ordinary with these last 4 that are standing here. I didn't find any broken rings on them or anything like that. There is a little bit of light scuffing on all the skirts, which is to be expected because I saw at least light scuffing in all 6 holes. I mean, 2 of them were really bad, but there was at least some scuffing in all 6. As far as the bearings go, most of these bearings are gone. This one's here. They don't look great. They're a little bit grooved up. Not terrible, but not great either. That's probably one of the better ones right there, too. Oh. So as far as what caused this to happen, there's too many different possible scenarios. I'll never know for sure, but obviously whatever it was affected the entire engine because there's at least some light damage across all 6 holes. Next thing I'm going to do is pull the liners out of the block. But before I do that, I would like to dump the rest of the coolant out of the block. Otherwise, it's all going to come pouring out when I pull the first liner up. I should be able to pull that little pipe plug right there out that's right beside the lower radiator hose. And that'll get the majority of the rest of the coolant out of the block. If you're not familiar with the 3406E, it is a spacer plated engine. The spacer plate is still here on the block deck right now, so that's why it looks like a counterbore engine. All right, I've got all 6 liners pulled out of the block. Spacer plate is off. And everything I'm seeing so far with the block looks all right. Always a little bit concerned about the condition of the lowers when you pull one of these apart. The lower is that smooth area down in there where the liner O-rings seal. The liner O-rings are down here on the bottom of the liner. Those 3 seal against the smooth area right down in there, and that's what seals the engine coolant away from the engine oil pan. So if you don't have a good seal there, you get coolant running down into the engine oil. So that's everything that needs to be disassembled for what I'm doing here. I'm gonna jump down to the bottom now and take a look at some main bearings. They're not terrible, but they're just bad enough. I'm gonna go ahead and put a set of mains in. I was hoping to get away with just throwing it together, not doing main bearings, but I'm gonna go ahead and put a set in there. And this number 2 main journal has got some rust on it, a little bit of corrosion damage. I don't know what that's from. I didn't have any water in the oil, so I guess it's just from sitting, but yeah, that crank could use a polishing job. That's just not gonna happen right now, but it's still smooth. That won't really hurt anything. It's just not ideal. Now I'm gonna go roll the crankshaft around. That bolt will push that bearing on around and out of there. All right, I'm looking for some new main bearings to roll in there. That looks like main bearings. Bearing main, yep. Why is there only 5 of those? Those look like bearings too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Here's one of the new upper main bearings. I'm gonna roll that in there now in either number 1 or number 2, whichever one I can get a better camera shot on. This is number 2. I've got the bearing stuffed in there as far as it would go by hand. And I've got a bolt with a nut snugged all the way up the shank, greased into the hole there. Bearing tab slot and the block is right up there. Bearing tab is right there. There's the new lower bearing and the number 2 main cap ready to go on. All right, caps on, bolts are snugged up. It's nice and even front to back on both sides. I'm kind of a fanatic about getting those caps on as perfect as I can get them. So next thing I'll do is torque the bolts. Go about 195 foot-pounds first, starting with the bearing tab side preferably. And then after the 195, actually I think the spec is like 190 plus or minus 10. I always set the wrench to about 195. I'll come back and go another 120 degrees after that, and that's the final torque. I don't know what that comes out to in foot-pounds, probably somewhere in the ballpark of 500. I'm back here at the number 4 main now. There's one of the thrust bearings. Other one's still in there. I'm not going to change them. I just wanted to look at them, make sure they look good, and they look brand new. So that's going to go right back in. Pop the crank back that way, and then I'll roll this one out. Yeah, looks fine. No reason to change that for what I'm doing right here. So right back in it goes. And I can tell just by the way the crank slides back and forth here and how it feels that I don't have excessive in play. It'll be just fine. All right, the mains are all done. Just want to make sure the crankshaft still rolls free. Now I've got to find some liners to put back in this block. This is where things are going to get a little bit more interesting. I've got this pile of liners here that I've kept out of core engines that I've torn down over the years. 99% of them I just scrapped, but these are some of the ones I've kept that I thought were in better shape. Every once in a while I'll get a core engine that's had a pretty fresh rebuild, and then for whatever reason it ended up becoming a core and getting torn down for parts. So I'm going to pick out 6 of these liners that I think are in halfway decent shape. These are the 7 I pulled out of there that I think are going to be the best to try to use. I got an extra one just in case I find something wrong with one of them. They're pretty rusty on the outside, but that's not really a big deal. As long as I get them cleaned up good for the heat transfer between the liner and the coolant, that's all that really matters. As far as the inside, crosshatch is pretty good. It's good all the way to the top. They're not really worn at all. There is some light surface rust in some of them. That's probably the worst of it right there. So I've got quite a bit of cleanup work to do here, but I think I can make this work. Filler band. These lower O-rings off. This right here is a counterbore shim for where they counterbored the block just a little bit and put a shim in. It's not something that you find on all of them, only on a block that's been counterbored. That's what those look like. Little WD-40 and some 150. Pretty happy with that. That'll work. Trying to get ready to put the liners in, so I'm cleaning up the chamfered areas that guide the liner O-rings down into their bores. Luckily, they're cleaning up pretty good so far. I haven't run into any pitting or anything yet. Hopefully I won't. I just hate doing stuff like this. I mean, an in-frame right from the get-go is a piss poor way to rebuild an engine. It's a band-aid at best. I mean, if you're gonna rebuild an engine, you pull it out of the machine or the truck or whatever it's in, you tear it down to the bare block and you rebuild it. Okay, I've got all the sealing areas inside the liner bores cleaned up good now. I just washed everything down with WD-40 and blew it all out with compressed air. Number 1 looks just fine, no problems there. Same thing with number 2. That looks like it's rough over there on that edge, but it's not. It's just the way the light's hitting it. Number 3, my luck started to run out. I was afraid it was going to, and sure enough, right there about the center of the screen, you can see that little bit of pitting, that rough area. That's not too bad. I could probably ignore that and get away with it. But then when I get over here to number 4, it's even worse. I can't ignore that right there. If I do, what'll happen as I put the liners in, that rough area will tear those liner O-rings, and torn O-rings don't seal. So I'll end up with coolant in the oil pan. Number 5 is even worse than number 4. That right there is pretty bad. That definitely will not work. And then number 6 is fine. No problems with it. So the right way to fix the damage in those lowers is to get the block to a machine shop. They'll bore that lower out, put an insert in, and make it like brand new again. That's obviously not an option here though. That can't be done in frame at all. So what I'm gonna have to do is a trick these guys sometimes use when they're doing these Band-Aid in-frame jobs. I'm gonna have to get some epoxy of some kind, doesn't really matter what kind. I think I've got some JB Weld, so that's probably what I'll use. Take the epoxy, smear it in the rough area, fill it in good, let it cure, come back and sand it smooth, and then that'll give me a smooth area for the liner O-rings to slide past and go in without being damaged, and that'll get me by. I've got the JB Weld smeared in these 3 lowers that need it. That's number 3. Here's number 4. And here's number 5. May have to put a little bit more in that one after it dries, but I'm gonna let that cure overnight. Come back in the morning, sand it down, and see what I've got. That's looking real good. Here's number 4. That's looking real good too. And here's number 5. Like I said before, I thought this one may need a little more JB Weld, and it looks like it's going to. So I'm gonna smear some more in those rough areas and get them filled the rest of the way in. And then while that's curing, I'm gonna throw some liners in, do a quick liner protrusion check. I cleaned this old spacer plate gasket up. This is not something you would normally reuse either, but I'm going to reuse it. So that's got to go on to check protrusion underneath the spacer plate. And here comes the spacer plate. Go get my bolts now and bolt that down. I've got the liner out of number 5 because that JB Weld's still not all the way hard yet. Alright, I'm checking liner protrusion. So what I'm measuring is the difference in height between the spacer plate and the liner flange right next to it, where the firing and the head gasket's going to seat. So I think I'm pretty well zeroed there. It's hard to tell from where I'm at. I'm way back here and the camera's in the way. I'm gonna slide from the spacer plate to the liner flange. And it looks like it went from 0 to about 4 thousandths. Yeah, a little over 3.5. So that one's right there around the 3.5, I'm gonna say. What I'll do is measure each liner about each 90 all the way around in 4 spots. Okay, I just finished checking protrusion. I had a couple measurements about 2.5 thousandths. I had a couple at about 4 thousandths, and then I had a bunch of 3 and 3.5 thousandths. So I'm within 1.5 thousandths across the entire engine, which is surprisingly good considering I've got a bunch of used parts here and just an in-frame block that hasn't been decked or anything. That's about as close as you can hope to be, even with all brand new parts, really. So that's well within spec, plenty good enough. I won't have any problems with that. I'm gonna start putting the liners in for real now. Here's this number 5 lower after the second dose of JB Weld, and after I sanded it down the second time. It's still not 100% perfect, but it's way better than it was. Just feels smooth there now. I can't feel anything with my fingers, so that's plenty good enough to guide those lower O-rings down into that bore with no damage, and that's all it needs to do. Just about got everything rounded up to start putting liners in now. I've got 6 sets of new IPD liner O-rings here. Clean engine oil ready to go for the filler bands, silicone lubricant for the lower O-rings, got a clean block of wood, clean towel, and I need to grab my hammer, and it should be pretty much ready to go. Got all 6 liners installed. So, shit. Time for some rods and pistons now, I guess. Let's see, let's just put this in here. Be a good place for that. Pretty good shot. This is gonna get a little more interesting right here. I'm gonna put used rods, pistons, and piston rings back in this thing too. So these are the rods and pistons that I pulled out of it. And these are a 180 7352 crown, which I'm real familiar with this crown. This is a standard high horsepower 1LW 2WS 6NZ on highway truck engine crown. 16:1 compression ratio. However, this truck calls for a 16.25:1 compression ratio crown. So what that means is that this crown that they had in there was not the correct one for this truck. Now, that's not the reason the engine failed the way that it did. Being just slightly lower in compression wouldn't have really caused any problems at all. And they were using the correct oil jet for this piston, which is the same oil jet as the piston that's supposed to be in there calls for too. But anyway, piston that the truck calls for is not as common, it's more obscure. and I don't really have any of them on hand used. I've got one option, and I'll show you what it is. So these crowns are the correct crown for the truck. The only problem with using these is that they're pretty high houred, and I don't know what kind of shape they're going to be in. All right, here's this first one all cleaned up. I just pressure washed it real good, and then I took a wire wheel around the top and around the outer edge, all the way around. And I'm not seeing anything here that's gonna prevent me from using this. It looks pretty good to me. I can still see the machining marks in all the outer parts of the ring lands here. Camera probably won't pick it up, but I can see them. They're not worn, they're not scuffed. I'll show you the wear pattern in the bushings. Kind of a crazy wear pattern, but they're not worn bad at all. So as long as the rest of them come out about like this one, I'm gonna go ahead and use them. This is a 136-1560 crown. Well, there's 6 used piston crowns cleaned up and ready to go. They all look just as good as that first one, if not a little bit better. Some of them did anyway. So I'm gonna use them, there's nothing wrong with them. I gotta have 6 skirts now, which I'll probably use some of these. The skirts are not really a big deal. They don't have to be absolutely perfect. You just don't want any that are scuffed bad or anything like that. So I'll get 6 of those cleaned up. If I need any different ones, I've got a whole bunch of those skirts over there. And then I'll clean up 6 rods and pins, which I may just use these right here. There's nothing wrong with any of these. The pins don't really wear at all, and the bushings and all these rods are fine. So let me keep cleaning stuff up here, and before long I'll have a complete set of rods and pistons. Okay, I've got all 6 rods, piston crowns, skirts, pins, retainers, oil control rings, and intermediate rings cleaned up and ready to go now. I just used the oil control rings and intermediate rings that came off of these pistons. They cleaned up real good and seem to be just fine. So the only thing I'm missing now is some rod bearings and top rings. Here's a few things that may be worth talking about, I don't know. This is a 133/75/37 crown. I got curious, what's the difference between these 2 crowns? They're both 16 1/4 to 1. So I wanted to compare them and see if I could find anything, and I have. I'm gonna measure the diameter of both these pistons above the top ring land. So on this one, you get about 5.336, 5.337. And then over here on this truck engine crown, same measurement, it measures about 5.379. So that's a little over 40 thousandths that this truck engine crown is bigger above the top ring land compared to this haul truck piston. 40 thousandths quite a bit. And I do have this clean where I'm taking that measurement. I don't have the very top clean. It's got some buildup on it, I think from burning coolant. But where I'm taking that measurement is clean. And then the only other difference that I can find between these 2 pistons, here in the oil control ring groove, and this truck engine piston, there are 4 holes drilled in it, one at every 90. And then here in the haul truck piston, there aren't any at all. As far as the rings go, this is one of the top rings out of the haul truck pistons that I'm putting in here. And I'm not gonna be able to really show this on camera in any real capacity, but these rings right out here on the very outer edge have a flare kind of like that, where they're worn a little bit. So I'm gonna try to find some top rings that are not quite as worn as these. I mean, these would run again, wouldn't really be a problem, but I've got some that are better than that, so I'll get some. As far as the oil control rings and intermediate rings, they cleaned up pretty much what I would call amazingly well. As far as I know, these rings have 18,000 hours on them. I don't have any way to verify that that's correct, but the best I can tell, that's the case. Could have sworn I had a set of new rod bearings here somewhere, but I've looked everywhere. I cannot find them. So I went over there and pulled these out. These are 100% used, but I'm gonna run them. The ones in this top row I think are in better shape, so I'm gonna run those in the tops of the rods, and then I'll run these in this bottom row in the bottoms. I've measured a bunch of this stuff out off camera, and it actually isn't in that bad a shape. I mean, none of it measures up brand new, but it's not excessively worn either. Wish this fly would get the hell out of here. Yeah, he's not having a very good day now. Took care of that dumb bastard. This is a lot easier when I can get my head in there and see what I'm doing on the back side. I got this tripod right in the way. Alright, all 6 rods and pistons are in. I'm gonna put the oil jets in now. I've got a little tiny piece of copper wire here, and what I'll do is just run it down in each one of these tubes. See that coming through there? And verify that they're clear. Because it is possible to get a piece of silicone stuck in one of these and block the flow of oil through it. And like I said earlier in the video, I've already verified that none of those are bent. Alright, I'm gonna get this cylinder head cleaned up and ready to go back on now. I don't see any problems with it at all. Everything looks real good to me. I don't see any cracks between valves, which is pretty common in an on-highway 3406E or C15 truck engine. You'll hardly ever pull one of those off without finding some cracks between valves somewhere. But in my experience, that's not nearly as common in these machinery and industrial application engines, just due to the difference in the application and the way that they run. The on-highway engines by far seem to be the hardest on cylinder heads. Look at all the Loctite they had in between the cam and the cam gear. Alright, I got the turbo pulled off, and the exhaust manifold center divider's in real good shape, which is a good thing. You kind of want to keep an eye on those, both on the exhaust manifold and on the turbo turbine housing. Those center dividers tend to warp and crack and everything else over time, and when they get in bad shape, it will cost you some efficiency. But that right there looks real good. Exhaust manifold's off. All the gaskets look fine. This one wasn't blown out, it just had some little pieces coming off the edge. I've got some new gaskets that I'm putting on here regardless, so get these pulled off of here. Okay, I've got everything blown down, dried off, and oiled up. Takes a lot longer to dry it off than it does to wash it. And then I ran a flat knife sharpening stone across here. I'll do that with these a lot of times to help clean them up. Those swirl marks you see are from the last time it was milled. I didn't do that with that stone. Got all that shit cleaned off the end there. It looks alright. It's not great, but it'll run again. This right here is the worst damage I'm seeing. There's a couple little pits right there in that lobe. I'm gonna try to smooth those up just a little bit. Not really much you can do about it, but I just don't want there to be any high areas. I don't think there are, but alright, I've got that better than it was when I started. It's not perfect, but it's never gonna be again. I'm looking at some of these cam bearings before I put the camshaft back in the head. And some of these are leaving a little bit to be desired, to say the least. This one's got a pretty good gouge in it right there running across it. And that's mostly all just from people pulling cams out and putting cams in this head, not being careful enough. You can remove and install these cams without the tool successfully without doing damage like that. It just takes time, it's tedious, and you just gotta be really careful. Of course, most of these guys aren't, they don't care, it's not theirs, so they just ram them in and out. But I'm gonna take some 2000 grit, slick them up just a little bit, call it good. The right thing to do would be to put cam bearings in it, but obviously I'm not gonna do that in this situation. Camshaft's going back in the head. I'm gonna go ahead and put the exhaust manifold on it now. Got all these inserts stuck back in here. And I've got all the hardware cleaned up. New gaskets. Alright, I've got all the spacers and washers and nuts on just finger tight. And the position of the manifold on the studs is good. It's got just a little bit of room to float back and forth from left to right, and that's the way you want it. You don't want it tied up against any of the studs. I did notice when I got the soot cleaned out of this thing, there's a pretty good sized crack going from this side to this side. Can't really see it from that side. If this was a real rebuild where I was spending real money, I'd want to change that. But for what I'm doing here, that'll be fine. It'll run for quite a while longer before that gets much worse. I've got a little bit of anti-seize on all the nuts, and I'm torquing them up to about 30 in sequence. I'm right here right now. Alright, I've got the head hoisted up here, and I'm getting ready to start cleaning up the head bolt holes in the block. I wasn't going to do that. I thought they were good enough, but I changed my mind. So this is what I like to use for that. That's just a head bolt with a channel ground in it with a grinding wheel. You got to grind that channel in there. You got to give that shit someplace to go. It's got to have somewhere to go. I've tried various different taps and stuff over the years, and they always seem to want to take too much material out of the block. So this is what I've always come back to. Okay, I've got the head bolt holes cleaned out, and I've got the block deck and the cylinders and everything cleaned up as good as I can. None of it's as clean as I want it to be, but it never will be. Putting a real light film of anaerobic sealant around all these oil drain back holes. These can be problematic, especially when you don't have freshly machined surfaces like I don't here. And normally I'm no fan of sealants where sealants aren't supposed to be, but this is one exception that I'll make. And Cat's new head gasket design for these engines has got little funnel-like deals that drop down in each one of these holes to solve that problem. But I'm going to be using an old IPD head gasket. That's what I've got on hand, so I won't have those funnels here. Here's one of them I found over here. While I'm here, I need a head gasket. Ready for the spacer plate now. Got some new coolant seals here. It's missing the front dowel pin that goes right there. I don't know what that's all about. It was never there. It wasn't there when I took the engine apart. So I guess they broke it or lost it last time they had this thing apart and just put it back together without it. But I'll run over and grab one. Okay, I'm just noticing this dowel pin deal and kind of sitting here studying it. And I thought something wasn't adding up. Didn't look right to me. They didn't lose the front dowel pin. They lost the rear dowel pin. This right here, this is not the rear dowel pin. This is the front dowel pin. You shouldn't be able to remove dowel pins like that. They're supposed to fit really tight. So I'll have to go get a hammer and tap that in carefully, but that's the front dowel pin. So I need to go get a rear dowel pin, which is a solid pin for that hole, and it'll actually fit back there tight. Got a dowel pin here. I had to go pull one out of a block, and it's not the greatest. It's got a little wear on top here, but the big thing with these is you want to make sure they're absolutely straight. And that one is. You get one of these that's bent at all, you will fight and fight and fight, and you never will get the head to go on. Okay, this is definitely not ideal. You want to do this without anything on the block, but I've already got all this shit put together now, so it's going in good. Well, now that I've got the dowel pins fixed, I think I'm finally ready to put the cylinder head on it. Alright, I've got the head swung over in here. Guide studs are in, and this is probably the last piece of video there's going to be till after the head's sitting down on the block. Okay, one more piece of video. I've got it pretty close right here. I had to abandon the studs. There was just no way it was going to work because I had to get underneath this timing sensor. I didn't really want to pull all that shit out of there. So it's still got to go forward just a little bit, which is not easy to do. I've got to pull this whole piece of shit forward by getting on the ground and yanking on those ropes. But just needs about 2 inches forward and then I think I can ease it down. All right, well, it's there. It didn't go bad, but it didn't go what I would call great either. This would have been a real good one to have had 2 people on. It was pretty tough by myself, but I'm sure it's fine. I didn't have to shift it probably more than a 1/4 inch after I set it down to get it to go ahead and fall on the dowels. I just hate it when you can't drop it straight down on them. And it's definitely seated all the way down on the dowels, so it's good to go. I've got the head bolts all cleaned up, so I'm gonna lube those up, stick them in the holes, run them down, torque them to initial torque, and that's probably as far as I'm gonna go today. I've just about had enough of this shit. You put the lube on the bolt, you smear it around. You take the bolts, stick it in a hole, and you spin it. Very exciting. Initial torque, 200 foot-pounds through the whole sequence. Come back, run through it again at 330. Come back again, run through it at 330 one more time, then you're done. Went just a little past 330 on that one, went to about 340, which is fine. That's still in spec. And this is just the second sequence anyway. Still got to go back over it one more time after this. All right, I've got the cylinder head all torqued down and ready to go. Next thing I want to do is get the oil pan back on it, but I've got to get an oil pump on it first, of course. So I went over and grabbed this pump. This is the one I pulled off the engine, and I noticed that this is a 4N0733 pump, mostly because they've got it written on the bottom right there. And I know from experience the 4N0733 crosses to the 0R9448 reman number. And I also know that this engine that I'm working on in this haul truck here does not take the 0R9448. It's supposed to have a 0R9449. Now with that being said, the only difference between those 2 pumps is this spring retainer right here. I mean, I guess why would you put the right oil pump on when you can put the wrong one on? I don't know, I don't get it. It's like some of these guys, they're determined to screw up as much shit as they possibly can. I don't understand what's going on out here. But anyway, I'm gonna pull this thing apart, pull the gears out of it, inspect the gears and the pump housing, make sure everything's in good shape. And if it is, I'll throw it right back together and put it on the engine. When I get it apart, I'll show how these things work that are real simple. I'm gonna get one of those spring retainers right now. I just jumped on SIS and looked up the number. I'm looking for a 9Y1792. So let's see what we got here. I got a handful of these pumps. That's what I'm looking for. Here's the difference between the 2. So this is the one that's supposed to be on it, and that's the one that was on it. This one's between a 1/4 and a 1/2 inch shorter. A little better way to look at that. Boy, that wasn't very smart. lose the timing on these gears. The reason I said that about the gears and the timing is not because this pump is timed. I mean, it's just a gear pump. I just want to keep the same gear teeth running with the same gear teeth. But in this case, I don't think it's going to matter. This pump is showing just enough wear that I'm going to do something different here. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not nearly as good as it could be either. So I've got a pile of these over there. I'm gonna find one that's in better shape than that. End of this shaft's pretty chewed up too. Of course, the bushing for it is the same way. This is a good opportunity to show how these pumps work though. So I've got the gears put back in. This is just a simple gear pump. Pretty much everybody knows how those work. So you've got the driven shaft here that's being driven off the crankshaft by that gear right there. So these gears would be turning like this. This is the suction side of the pump. This is the discharge side of the pump. And this is all one big chamber in here. That goes straight over into here. So, hang on, let me make this thing focus. All right. So these would be turning like this. The oil's coming in. It's getting in between the gear teeth here. It's being pulled around the outer edge, in between the gear teeth and the outer edge of the pump housing. On the top, same thing on the bottom. This would be going like this. Come on. So it's pulling the oil in between the gear teeth, forcing it around the outer edge and over to this side. So that's how the flow is made from the suction side and forced over to the discharge side. Now there's one more thing to these pumps. They're just a simple gear pump like I said, but there's a valve here. This is the plunger for the valve. It goes down in this bore right here. So that's down in there. Before I put that in there though, I'm gonna pull these gears back out and show this passage. Now, I don't care about the timing anymore because I'm not using this pump anyway. All right, see that hole right there? Well, that's all connected to the discharge side. This whole open area in here is all connected. There's a passage that runs underneath from this hole right here, underneath all this metal right here under my finger, and over to this port. So here's the plunger. That's solid on the bottom. It's down in this bore. And then there's a spring, and then the spring retainer that holds that on and puts pressure on the spring. So you can see that the spring is pushing on the plunger and trying to force the plunger closed. So what that means is whatever pressure is on the discharge side of the pump is also on the end of this plunger, on the bottom end, the end that's down in the hole. And that's trying to push that plunger back up against the spring pressure. All right, it's the next day from that video clip you just watched. I had to quit, but I think I remember where I was at. So as this plunger comes up in the bore against the spring pressure, that's exposing those holes down there in the end of the plunger just like that. And as those holes become exposed, that allows some of the flow from the discharge side of the pump to flow back through the passage and out through those holes. So what that's doing is putting that flow directly back into the suction side of the pump. Okay, so now with all that shit out of the way, the 0R9449 oil pump with its shorter spring retainer puts more spring pressure on top of the plunger, which means the plunger is harder to lift, which means that the engine will have to build more oil pressure before the plunger will lift, which in turn means that with the 0R9449 pump, the engine will be able to produce a higher maximum oil pressure than it will with the 0R9448 pump and its longer spring retainer. This is the second pump I pulled out of my pile over there. The first one I wasn't happy with either, but this one's looking better. I'm gonna go with it. Definitely not brand new, but it's not bad. Plenty good enough to run for quite a while longer. All right, I got it all ready to go. 9Y1792. Got a newer style pump housing here. Got this flat area on top, but that's insignificant. Internally, same as the other one. Takes the same gears, the same spring, same plunger, same everything. Got the pressure tube and the suction tube cleaned up and ready to go on. So I'm gonna get all this bolted on the block now. Oil pan's ready to go on. Alright, I got the pan on, all the bolts are in, and they're all torqued twice. And I'm certain that that was the most piss poor pan installation I've ever done. But I don't know what you can do about it. In frame's a damn joke. You can always do a better job out of frame than you can in frame. I don't care how good you are. But this is one of those deals where the in frame was the only thing that made any sense, so it is what it is. I don't know who did this, probably the same people that put the wrong pistons in the engine and the wrong oil pump on and glued the cam gear to the camshaft and a handful of other little stuff I found. But not only did they do all that, they also decided that it was going to be a real good idea to go ahead and plumb in a second fuel filter base that's not even supposed to be there. So that one up there is correct. It's supposed to be remote mounted like that. This one should not even exist on this engine. So I have no idea why they thought they needed to put that on there. And I wasn't going to worry about it at first. I mean, it was working fine, but the more I think about it, it seems a little excessive to push fuel through two 2-micron filters. And it's never going to be any easier to fix than what it is right now. Well, I found the problem, figured out why it scuffed those liners the way it did. This is probably the most important part of this whole video right here. I was in here working on getting this extra fuel filter base pulled off of here and getting all these fuel lines cleaned up where they had made a mess of everything. Had it all screwed up. Put the wiring harness back up there kind of where it goes. It's not done yet. And then I went to put the intake elbow back on the cylinder head, and when I did, this is what I found. That's a wide open hole going right into the intake elbow. So that's 100% for sure the reason the engine failed and scuffed those liners the way it did. There's no doubt in my mind. It would have just been sitting there sucking dirt in anytime it was sitting around idling waiting to get loaded or whatever, and these trucks do a lot of that. The reason I'm just now noticing that, when I pulled that elbow off, I did it from the top side and I just laid it up in there somewhere, and that's all I ever did with it. And I know for sure that it was like that when I started this, that I didn't take something out of there because I know why that hole's there and I know what used to be in it. Normally these have a ether injection system on them, so there's a bracket back here behind the cylinder head that holds an ether canister. There's a plastic line that runs up to a fitting on that elbow, and when you push a button in the cab, it injects ether into the elbow. Well, they've removed the ether injection system at some point in the past before I ever bought the truck. But when they did that, they never came back and put a plug in that hole. Here's another one of these trucks, and there's that ether injection system I was just talking about. And here's another one of these trucks that I've got a better view of the intake elbow on than the other one. And if you look right there, you can see the little plastic line for the ether and the fitting that came out of that hole. Well, it just keeps getting better. I'm barely any further along than I was a few minutes ago. And I just realized that I don't remember pulling the plug out of that hole right there. I would have had no reason to pull the plug out of that hole right there. And I don't have a plug that fits that hole in any of my parts piles from this engine. So I thought, all right, well, let me make sure. So I went back to the footage where I had just pulled the head off and I had it hanging over there beside the machine, zoomed in on it, and sure enough, that's exactly how the head came off. There never was a plug in it. I could even see some dirt packed in the hole there. So not only did they leave that plug out and it was sucking dirt right there, but they left that one out and it was sucking dirt right there too. It never had a chance. Right here we've got a pipe thread plug that they rammed into an O-ring hole. So now that's junk. I've got to change this out for the one that they had over there that wasn't even supposed to be there to begin with. At least they gave me one, I guess. The more I look, the more I find. I guess I need to quit looking. I guess they must have put this filter on here with like a 12-foot breaker bar or something. I finally got it to move though. Alright, none of this was really video worthy, but here's where I'm at. I've got the ECM back on it. I've got the one fuel filter base that's supposed to be here plumbed in correctly. I've got all the sensors in and plugged in their correct locations. I've got all the holes in the cylinder head plugged, which, I mean, that should be a real good deal. It won't be sucking dirt anymore or have massive boost leaks, so that should be nice. Timing pin is in the flywheel, which is just that bolt right there. That's pinning number 1 and number 6 at top dead center. And I'll come back through here later and tidy a bunch of this up and zip tie stuff up where it's not hanging loose and rubbing and whatnot. But it's all here and all back together and all right now. So the next thing I want to do is get the front gear train back together, which means I've got to get the cam gear put back together. I've got it over there torn apart on the bench right now. Before I start on the cam gear, here's a quick overview on the fuel flow in this setup. This is the fuel tank right here. Comes out of the fuel tank through that fitting right there, comes up through this suction line, runs into this filter head. This is the fuel water separator filter. Comes out of that filter head right there, runs down through this line, underneath the engine and over to the other side. And then of course fuel has to return to the tank too. So that line down there beside this one is this line, which is the return line. It puts the fuel back into the tank right there. Okay, I'm over on the other side of the truck now. Pretty hard to video this, but I'll do the best I can. So once the suction line or the supply line gets to this side, the first thing it does is goes into the fuel transfer pump, which is right there. It's gonna go through the pump, it's gonna come out of the pump through that line right there, which comes around and runs up to this filter base right here through this line. It's gonna go through the 2-micron filter, which obviously is not there right now. It's gonna come out of that filter base right here, come through this line. It drops down and runs back and runs into the ECM right there. It's gonna go through the ECM to cool the ECM down. Comes out of the ECM right there through that fitting, comes up through this hose, up over the top of the intake elbow, and then up over the top of the head right there. This is that line as it comes up over the top of the head, goes into that fitting right there, drops down and goes into the cylinder head. Where it comes through the head, supplies all 6 injectors with fuel, and then it comes out of the back of the head right here. So there's that line as it comes out of the back of the cylinder head. Comes through here, I've got it routed up over the intake elbow. Comes down through here and runs back to that fuel filter base. When it gets back to the fuel filter base, runs through here, there's a valve in here, goes through the valve, comes out right there, drops down through this line, runs underneath the engine and back over to the other side and into the tank. Okay, here's the 2 timing gears that I've got off the engine. Alright, inner cam sealing ring is going in. Got to line the bolt holes up. It'll go in there like that. That's what that looks like. Next is the cam adapter. It's got a dowel in it that has to line up and go into the hole in the cam. like that. And then next is this retaining ring. Goes on there like that. And then the bolts get Loctite. They go in like that and hold everything together. 3 of them. Alright, I've got the cam gear on and torqued to spec, which is 180 plus or minus 30 foot-pounds. I usually go about 190. No Loctite on those bolts unless you're an idiot. If you're an idiot, go ahead and put it on there. And I don't torque mark any of my bolts when I'm working on my own stuff. I don't have to worry about protecting me from me. I'll do that if I'm working on something that doesn't belong to me, so they can't come back and say I didn't torque something, but no big deal. Like everything else the last guys did on this engine, this is wrong too. The backlash there is way too loose. So I'm gonna have to adjust that. That's the adjustable idler gear. It adjusts back and forth to set the backlash there. That needs to be tightened up. And then obviously the other thing I've got to worry about is getting the engine in time, which it's not right now. That's the timing dot right there, and that's the mark right there. I really wasn't wanting to have to mess with backlash, but I'm going to. That's just too much. I mean, it would run, but that's too much. So I've got to loosen all those nuts up, change that setting on that stub shaft. It kind of rolls back and forth, tightens up going one way, loosens going the other, and then snug the nuts back up, retorque them with new Loctite. Got the backlash adjusted where I'm happy with it. That's way better. And I rolled the cam around just a little more. I think yeah. It's hard to tell from where my head's at. I'm pretty sure I'm 1 tooth off. That dot needs to move over 1 tooth. So, see if I can do this all one-handed. Now I've got to go this way by a tooth. That's too much. Phone's giving me some kind of bullshit. All right. Now, it's back in here. It's not going to go yet because we're not lined up. Which way do I need to go here? Let's go like that and see what we got. Looks better from here, but I'm not sure it is. Let me get my head down in there. All right, yes, it is in time now. You just got to make sure that the tooth with the dot is the one that's the closest to the mark on the front cover. I'm all done in here. The front gear train's all back together and ready to go. Peanut cover's on. I've got this oil line on that goes from the pan over to the drain valve right there. And I've got the oil filter base back in here. That's a pain in the ass trying to get that back on and get those lines hooked to it. Took me probably half an hour, but it's all ready to go now. I've got a new stack here and a flapper for it. I'm gonna go ahead and put the injectors in now, and then I'll put the valve cover base on right after that. This is one of the injectors I pulled out of the engine. They all look just like this one. Look like some pretty fresh cat remans. You can see the 10R0955 number there. That's the cat reman number for what I'd call a 55 injector. So this is a 2000 EPA non-road emission standard engine, which is why they could use a 55 here to make 427 horsepower, I think is all it is. If this were an on-highway engine, they wouldn't have been able to do that. They would have used a lower flowing injector with a longer pulse width. But anyway, nobody cares about all that shit. I could elaborate further, but got some new injector O-rings here. I'm gonna start sticking those on the injectors and putting the injectors in the head. valve bridges. I kept all these internal parts on this table covered up the whole time, so they're still clean. There's no dirt on them, just old oil, which is no big deal. Not gonna clean any of this up before I put it back on, just gonna throw it on and go. That'll be plenty good for what I'm doing right here. If this was a real rebuild, obviously that would be different. Put these studs in for the jakes. I forgot about those. A little bit of rusty, gunky shit on here from the truck sitting out in the lot for 2 years not being used. All right, so I've got all the rocker arms and jake housings on here now. I've got to get them bolted down. Of course, I've got things I've got to fix that they've screwed up here. That's the wrong washer. These two in the middle are correct. Wrong one down there on the end, so I've got to go round up some of those correct washers. You don't want to just use anything you got, because these need to be a good hard washer, the correct one. That's very important. And then the other thing is they should have changed these bolts out for the hang on, let me pull the part number out of my tiny little brain. 257 2122 bolts. You need 9 of them. Can't run it in the third hole back. That's the oil supply hole, but the other 3 in each housing need to be updated. You can see the difference between the two. The old bolt's neck down right here for oil supply, but you only need that oil supply in the third hole back on each housing, so they did away with those in all but the third hole. Started using these heavier shanked bolts, which torque tighter, and that helps to keep the rocker shaft from working in the cylinder head and wearing the cylinder head in the rocker shaft. Those bolts over there are sufficient as long as they're properly torqued and you keep an eye on them, but most of the time that doesn't happen, so replacing 3 of those with these pretty much solves that problem. I'll go about 80 to 85 on the small bolt, 110 to 115 on the 3 bigger bolts, and then 80 to 85 on this nut. The jake brake specs say 80, 80, and 110. I've got the top end all together, and I'm running the overhead now. I'm trying to roll through this pretty quick. All right, I've got the first half of the overhead run, and I'm rolling the engine around 360 degrees, which will give me 180 degrees on the cam, so that I can run the other half of the overhead. I don't know how many times I've been up and down these steps, but it's been a lot. All right, I've got all the valves adjusted, the jakes are adjusted, and the injectors are adjusted, so that's all done. Need to get some oil in it now and get some valve covers put on it, or at least a couple of them. I just went over to the other shop and grabbed an oil filter and a fuel filter and 10 gallons of oil. Coolant's back in. I've got the batteries off of it. I had them out there on another machine. This in here has seen better days. I'm gonna clean this up a little bit before I put the batteries back in. piece of shit. Well, I think I sucked half the truck up in the vacuum cleaner, but that looks a lot better. There ain't much left of it. Hopefully the batteries don't fall through and hit the ground. Alright, I've got the batteries in and hooked up. Good enough for now. It's a 24 volt system, obviously. Alright, I guess about the only things left to do here are to get the turbo on it, the exhaust pipe from the turbo back to this exhaust elbow, a couple pieces of intake piping, and then I can start priming the fuel system and get it fired up. These 9AP prefix engines run a great big 184AR exhaust housing, non-wastegated, about a 78mm compressor wheel, best I can tell from just a quick rough measurement. So quite a bit different turbo than what you'll find on an on-highway 3406E. This is a high load, high RPM application, and that's what this turbo is sized to do. It's pretty lazy until you get up there about 17 to 1800 RPM with some load on it, and then it comes alive from there. Alright, I've got the air intake piping all back together now. I've got the exhaust together back to the elbow back here. I'm leaving this valve cover off so I can verify that the cylinder head's getting oil to it when it starts up. Got fuel to the back of the cylinder head. You should have just seen it squirting out of that fitting there while I was pumping the hand primer. So I'm gonna put that fuel line back on, go prime on it just a little bit more, start cranking on it, and get it fired up. Here we go. Well, I guess I'm pretty happy with that. Not bad for a bunch of used junk. Runs good, sounds good, it's got good oil pressure, no blow by. Way, way better than what I had when I started. And I only spent about $300 on stuff I didn't already have. But it's not over yet. I've still got to get the jakes working. Got to program the injector trim codes. I want to check all the sensor readings, make sure they're reading correctly and making sense. And I'll probably go ahead and probe it and calibrate the timing too while it's here. I might as well. And all that's fine and good, but until I get the truck over there and get it loaded, which puts it up there about 149 to 150,000 pounds is what it's rated for, and I start climbing some 20% grades with it, I won't really know what I've got. That'll be the real test. Alright, I'm programming injector trim codes here. I wrote them down on this piece of cardboard when I put them in. On number 3, that's a 2425. 2425. Number 4, 4530. 4530. As far as the Jake brakes go, it doesn't seem to be a problem with the lever in the cab. It's off now. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3. Pulling this plug out of the timing probe hole. Yeah, you're not going to be able to see in there, but the crankshaft is right in there. And there's a machined spot on the counterweight on the crank. I'll just go show you a crank. This is not the ideal thing to show this, but all my good cranks are in there wrapped in plastic from the machine shop and you can't see anything, so this will work. This is a 3406E crank right here on top. Normally there'd be a drive gear up here, but it's pulled off. This second counterweight back they machine smooth, where normally it's a rough cast finish like that one. This one is machine smooth, and they also machine a groove into it down here. You can see the groove right there. And when you push the probe into the block, into that hole that I just pulled the plug out of, you're pushing the probe right up against this smooth counterweight, and then you pull it back about 1 millimeter. And as the crankshaft whirls around in there and this groove passes the end of that probe, it generates a signal that goes to the ECM and gives the ECM an exact timing calibration reference point. What you're supposed to do to install the probe correctly is pin the engine number 1 and number 6 at top dead center. Doesn't matter which one's on compression. And then roll it backwards against the direction of normal rotation by 60 degrees. Here's the probe. This adapter threads into the block, and then the probe slides back and forth in it. When you get it where you want it, you tighten this nut down, and that'll hold it in place. Alright, the timing calibration is done. I've got the probe back out of the block, and that's the cable that goes with it. So I've got everything done to the engine now that I wanted to do, other than getting the Jake brakes working. That's next. Let me back up to before I did all this. Before I took the engine apart, I knew that I had a Jake brake problem. I knew that I only had 1 out of the 3 housings that were working, and I also knew that it was the center housing that was the one that was working. I knew that because on position 1 on the Jake switch, I had 1 housing working, which was normal. That would be the center housing. On position 2, I had nothing, which should be the front and the rear housing. And then on position 3, I had only 1 out of the 3 housings again, which obviously that was the center housing working again. So now that I've took the engine apart and put it back together, I did not keep track of which Jake housings went where because it really doesn't matter. I kept the rocker arms and rocker shafts right where they came from. The rest of it I didn't keep track of. So it's obviously gone back together in a different order than it came apart in, which is fine. I'm actually glad it did, because now I still only have 1 out of the 3 housings that's working, but it's moved. It's not the center housing that's working now. So that tells me that it's not, or more than likely not, an electrical issue like I initially thought it was going to be. So with all that being said, I'm going to get in there and fire it up, and then I'm going to come back up here. I'm going to manually actuate each one of these solenoids, and I'm going to see what happens, and that'll tell me where I need to go next. Alright, so now I know for almost 100% sure that it's the rear housing that's working with the switch in the cab, and that it's the front 2 that are not. I also know that the wiring to the center housing should be good. It shouldn't be an electrical issue that's keeping it from working, because that was the one that was working before I did the rebuild and switched these housings all around. So with that knowledge in mind, the next most common sense thing to do, especially since I have some of these solenoids here, is to change this one out and this one out. Come back and see what it does then. More than likely that'll fix it. Right here is what I'm looking for. 24 volt There's the new used solenoids with new seals on them, ready to go. Okay, those are in, so now same thing again, go back, fire it up, come up here, push the button on top of both of them and make sure they work. Well, I gained a little bit, but not very much. This front housing did start doing something at least, but it's not right. I think it's only working on one of the two cylinders. You could probably tell in that last clip that that one is not like this one back here. That one there is good to go. And the center one is still not doing anything at all. So I'm gonna have to tear into both of these and see what's going on inside of them. All right, I've got both of these Jake brake housings torn down now, and I found the problem with both of them pretty quickly. This is number 2, the one that was in the center that wasn't doing anything at all. It had a stuck control valve, which is that thing right there. I got it freed up pretty easily. It wasn't stuck bad, but it was stuck. And then it still has a master piston stuck in this bore right here. And then same thing over here. This is number 1, the one that was partially working. Didn't have any stuck control valves, but it does have a stuck master piston just like the other one. See, that one's out of there. That's the master piston. And that one's stuck in the bore. Won't be any problem. I've rebuilt a ton of these 340 housings, and I've dealt with a whole bunch of them with moisture damage, except for way worse than this, so I'll get them fixed. I got both the stuck master pistons out of both housings. They were stuck bad, worse than I thought they were gonna be, based on what they looked like. I'm really tired of talking to this camera. Had to destroy both pistons to get them out, which is fine because I was able to save the housings, which is the important part. Pressure washer wouldn't get either one of them. Normally it will, but in this case it wouldn't. I started drilling on this one just a little bit. That loosened it up enough that I could blow it out of there with compressed air. This one I started to tap for a 1/4 bolt. Ended up breaking the end of the tap off in the piston when I was screwing the tap back out. So that left me with no choice but to go to plan C, which is a torch. I heated that up cherry red, quenched it with water, and then I blew it out of there with compressed air too. So I'll go over there and get some good used master pistons to replace the 2 that I destroyed here, get these housings back together, and get them back on the truck. I got them put back on. Let's test them out, make sure they work. That front housing is still only working on 1 cylinder. I don't know what the deal with it is now. I'm gonna swap the solenoid out first, make sure it's not a bad solenoid. It's got used control valves in it too. I can swap those out without pulling the housing off if I need to. This middle one is good to go now. They act kind of funny when you first turn them on after you've had them apart. They got to get all the air purged out of them. That's normal. it came around and started acting right. The front one never did. All right, there's another different used solenoid. Let's try it. Well, that's what I thought. It didn't change anything. I couldn't come up with any reason why a bad solenoid could possibly make half the housing work and the other half not. That really wouldn't have made any sense. I just want to start there because they're fast and easy to change. But I guess I'll swap the control valves out now and see what I get. Come on. There we go. Alright, there we go. Finally got her working right. Now all I gotta do is check and make sure it works electrically with the switch in the cab. Alright, all good. The engine is finally completely ready to go. It was a waste of time cleaning this tire up. I got to digging at this piece of metal right here, and it goes all the way through. So that would have to be patched, and it's just not worth it. That tire's got all kinds of metal and stuff in it. It came off a landfill truck, that truck right there actually, and it's just full of shit. So I'm gonna call that one junk. And I guess that puts me down to having just one halfway decent junk tire left, which is that one right there. So that one will go on right there, and then whatever else is on the truck is just what it's going to be there. I'm trying to run this junk rubber out and get whatever I can out of it. I've got one good set of rubber for these 40-ton trucks, and it's already over there on my other truck. I've got pretty serious doubts that this tire is going to hold up very many loads, but I don't have any other options. I mean, I don't have anything else here that's any better than this, so this is what it's going to have on it until it blows out. load of topsoil way down there, and then I'll have to pull up this hill, which is probably I don't know, 10 or 12%. It's not real bad. And then I've got to haul down through a bottom and back up the other side. Alright, well, came up the first hill there with no trouble at all. It's got a little bit of blow by, which is to be expected. Used rings, used liners. Even on a new engine with brand new parts, you'd see some blow by, being a brand new engine. That'll improve some as the engine wears in and the rings seat up. So now I've got to drop off on this bottom. And this hill right here is quite a bit steeper than the one I just climbed. Probably looks flat on the camera, but it's not. It's about a 20% all the way to the bottom from where I'm standing right here. Alright, now I'm coming back up out of the bottom. This is probably over 20% right here. It is when you map it out and measure the distance anyway. Hadn't spun any bearings yet, so I think I'm alright. I sure hope that parking brake is good, because if it's not, you're fixing to see a show. Alright, from here the rest of the way to the back, it's only like 4 to 8%, just varies. And it's like, I don't know, it's another 3/4 of a mile back there or so, but it's no big deal from here to there. Well, I guess I'm pretty happy with that overall. That cheap engine job will get me the rest of the life out of that truck. I don't figure it'll last too much longer. It'll be something else, torque converter, transmission, who knows, it's always something. But I'll run it till it don't run no more. Guess that's all I got for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.